New Zealand, Aotearoa, land of the long white cloud, land of 4.5 million people in cities, towns, villages, communities and farms, a land of hills and mountains, rivers and lakes, beaches and islands, a land of agriculture, with dairy farms, cattle and sheep, wheat and other grains, forestry, fruit trees, horticulture, even viticulture, a land of industry, innovation and opportunity. Though as far from Scotland as it is possible to get, a large number of New Zealanders, Kiwis, have Scots ancestors, some of who have may been forced to immigrate, or, like me, chose to immigrate here, lured by the promise of opportunity in a new land. One of the major cities here, Dunedin, was founded by Scots who brought their hard work, industry and willingness to overcome the rigours of wild areas of a new colony. Thomas Burns, nephew of Robbie, was one of those settlers and helped establish the Otago Boys' School, the Otago Girls' High School, and the University of Otago. There are a lot of similarities between Scotland and New Zealand. Population size is similar, and both have similar industries. Both countries have the same queen. But there are also some differences. Some are relatively minor. While New Zealand has gas fields with a little oil, Scotland has oil and gas in abundance. Others are more striking. Scotland currently has Trident, while New Zealand, well, it's nuclear free. But what is the main difference? New Zealand has its own parliament, separate from Westminster. It's had its own responsible government since 1856, following the passage of the New Zealand Constitution Act. It became more independent later on, and Westminster could no longer pass legislation for New Zealand. It therefore has its own police force and its own defence forces, and can certainly afford them, and has done since the mid-1800s. It's in charge of its own economy, its own taxes, health and education systems, and can definitely afford these too. Surely, if New Zealand can do this, with around the same population but less physical resources, Scotland can do the same without Westminster. Westminster is happy to support other nations in Europe and elsewhere attaining independence, and was quick to divest itself of its Anglicized colonies, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, though slower to leave those colonies where white settlers were a minority. However, Westminster seems to be very reluctant to allow an independent Scotland. Yet things have moved on in the past 300-odd years. Despite the supporters of Westminster domination continuing to claim, as William Seaton of Pittmidden did, that Scotland is poor and without force to protect its commerce, and will not continue to prosper without the trade and protection of some powerful neighbour nation. Scotland, an independent Scotland, would be a rich country. Pittmidden's fear that without the Union, a number of Scots would withdraw themselves to foreign countries came true even with the Union, some through clearances, many more, like myself, voluntarily seeking a better life. Claims made by Unionist supporters and the leadership are time after time shown to be false, mere scaremongering. The claim the oil will run out has already been shown to be false even before it was made. Perhaps we're talking about those oil fields that will be under the control of the remaining UK, the ones they gained by bending the sea border northwards. But what's not widely known is that in 1975, Professor Macron, working on a report for Westminster's Treasury, stated that if Scotland were to become independent at that time, the Scottish Government would have been in surplus, would have had a very strong currency, and would have been able to invest in industry and infrastructure. This report was kept secret for nearly 30 years, during which Westminster continued to lie to Scotland. Other comments are thinly veiled threats. Though a currency union would be beneficial for both newly independent countries, Scotland, like New Zealand, could have a currency of its own if Westminster refuses. There is, however, nothing to prevent that. Backed by oil and technology, I believe, like Macron did nearly 40 years ago, that the Scots pound would be strong. The United Kingdom doesn't have a monopoly on the pound as currency, just as the US doesn't have a monopoly on the dollar as currency. Claims that Scotland is too small are as real as Wee Willie Winkie, something told to children to keep them quiet. Iceland has less people, Liechtenstein and Luxembourg are far smaller in both population and area, and yet are independent. None of them have oil, for example. Liechtenstein has the highest GDP per person in the world and one of the lowest unemployment rates, while Luxembourg has an advanced economy with the world's second highest GDP per capita. Other countries, with and without oil, outside Europe, are also smaller than Scotland. Yet all of these countries are independent, and many have thriving economies. The claim that Scotland is too small can therefore be seen to be the fairy story that it is. Scottish voters aren't children and don't like being patronised, and, contrary to the beliefs of certain Unionists, are as genetically programmed as any others to make their own political decisions. In 1706, Westminster set out to bribe Scots members of Parliament to support the Union. Money and titles won the vote, with the Duke of Queensberry being made Duke of Dover and receiving a payment of £12,325. Recently, with the gap between yes and no closing in the polls, Westminster has tried to bribe the Scots again, with a promise of more devolution, Devo Max, if Scotland remains part of the Westminster hegemony. I believe the Scots can see through this for the panic bribe that it really is. Westminster seems to really want to believe that we have catched the Scotch and will hold them fast. I believe the people of Scotland have realised how Westminster has treated them in the past, and can see through this offer of Devo Max for the castle in the air that it really is, having learned lessons from the '79 referendum, the Thatcher government, and subsequent Conservative, Labour and coalition governments. Since '45, the majority of MPs returned to Westminster from Scotland have been Labour. Only 6 years out of 68, Scotland has mostly voted for the Tories. Yet 56% of governments, 38 out of 68 years, at Westminster have been led by Tories. That isn't what Scotland voted for. Successive Tory and Labour government policies have had negative effects on Scotland, from Thatcher's poll tax and attacks on coal and shipbuilding industries, through Blair and Brown's indifference to the plight of industry in Scotland and of people, to Cameron's bedroom tax and attacks on the poor and vulnerable. Some Tory MPs are pledging to vote against any proposal to give Devo Max. The Scottish Labour Party, who have been languishing in the polls in Scotland since before 2007, should see this as an opportunity of renewal. Rather than oppose it and vote no, Scottish Labour should support the vote. Only by doing so will they be able to set their own policies that benefit Scotland, rather than have policies set by others who hold more votes and may not have the best interests of Scotland at heart. The only way Scotland can control her own destiny is to vote yes on September the 18th. While Johnny Belhaven believed that the Union would cause Mother Caledonia to breathe out her last with an et tu quoque mi fili, the referendum in '97 allowed her to take a new breath. Yet Scotland was still tied to Westminster. This referendum can set her free. Free of the bonds of poverty Westminster has imposed, free of taxes that negatively affect Scotland's poor, her vulnerable and her pensioners. Scots would be free to choose their own way, make their own decisions and elect their own true representatives, governing themselves instead of being governed for others they didn't even vote for. Vote yes for freedom, for choice. Vote yes for Scotland. Vote yes for independence.